New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos. You can now download a free PDF copy or purchase a beautiful printed edition of Issue 5 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and today we're going to explore Carl Gustav Jung, the great Swiss psychiatrist, and three of his most significant relationships with Sigmund Freud, with J.B. Rhine, and with Wolfgang Pauli. My guest is Dr. Davis Brimberg, a clinical psychologist, a former college professor, a former handler of wild owls. She is the author of Teachings from the Gatekeeper, a memoir and journey into parapsychology. Welcome, Davis.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today.
And once again, thank you for coming to Albuquerque, all the way from Seattle. This is our third interview here in my little studio. I'm very grateful that you made the trip, and I encourage our viewers to check out your book.
Thank you. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm very excited.
Well, we're going to be talking a little more professionally about the history of psychology and psychotherapy, which is your profession,
Yes.
and in particular, the life of Carl Gustav Jung and his relationships. Let me ask you to begin with, do you consider yourself a Jungian? Where do you stand in relationship to Jungian psychology?
I think he was extraordinary, and I think his theories are phenomenal. I would describe myself as eclectic. I'm a mixture of a lot of different theorists, and certainly the psychological theorists that influenced my work the most would be Jung, Freud, Carl Rogers. Yeah, that mixture.
I have very high opinions of all three of those people. Carl Rogers came out of the University of Wisconsin, where I did my undergraduate.
Nice. I did not know that. Yeah.
But with regard to, let's start with Jung and Freud. That's the famous relationship.
Absolutely. Yes.
And really, to the best of my understanding, the relationship hinged on their attitudes towards paranormal phenomena.
Well, it's a big part of what separated them, ultimately. The two of them, of course, were the major archaeologists of the psyche, and they did extraordinary work about the unconscious. For Freud, his psychology is much more focused on the individual as well as their relationship with their families. But Jung really extended Freudian ideas beyond just the individual and beyond their immediate family, beyond their personal unconscious, of course. And he got into the collective unconscious, into the archetypes.
And the collective unconscious is a term that I have had difficulty understanding or defining. I recall one Jungian who told me, well, the collective unconscious is actually the whole world.
Mm-hmm. I think of it as more of all of humanity. Mm-hmm. It's more than just the whole world. It's sort of, my understanding is it's all people throughout history of time.
That's pretty big.
Yes.
all human experiences.
All human experiences.
And it immediately implies that we have some sort of a non-physical connection with people in distant times and places.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you look at Jung's ideas in terms of what was happening in ancient art, right? He talks about how this is how you see repetitions and patterns across artwork. Let's say that was happening in the tombs of Egypt, as well as all the way over in ancient times, let's say in Mexico, right? You say that these are the commonalities that exist because they exist within the human psyche.
And the commonalities are what he would think of as expressions of the archetypes.
That's right. And that the archetypes show up in our dreams as well as myths, fairy tales, legends. You can even see it in artwork, religions, things of that nature.
So sometimes Jungian psychology is called archetypal psychology.
Yes. Yes. Many people have told me how much they hate Freud, but they love Jung. But what these people don't understand is that the brilliant, mind-blowing, beautiful theories that Jung developed could not have been possible without him first being mentored by Freud. It was in their time together where they really dug into what was happening in the unconscious. That was where Jung was able to further develop his ideas on the psyche.
And how did the relationship begin?
Jung reached out to Freud, and it was about some research that he was doing. They met up. They spoke continuously for 13 hours. They just talked nonstop. Their relationship only lasted 5 years. And it's amazing what these two men did in their time together. People talk about soul relationships, and they often focus on soul relationships in terms of romantic partnerships. But Freud and Jung absolutely had some sort of soul contract going on. The extent to which they have changed the way that people have thought is just, it's phenomenal what these two men were able to discover.
They were both giants.
Giants.
In their own
yes.
right.
Yes.
And, obviously, Freud recognized something in Jung that he didn't see in his other followers.
No. He saw that Jung was a genius. And Freud, a genius himself, I love Freud. I will defend him to the end. And in the same breath, I think if we met him, he would probably tell us that he was a genius. I think that he was extremely aware of just how brilliant he was. And I think he was able to see that happening in Jung. He saw his other followers as talented, I'm sure. There's no doubt about that. He certainly saw the talent of Adler, let's say. But with Jung, it was something else. And the two of them had this father-son dynamic. And Freud very much saw Jung as his son, which made it to be it made it extra painful when Jung essentially defected from Freud's circle.
And how did that come about?
A big part of it was Jung's interest in parapsychology. And Freud thought it was all nonsense. At least that's what he said at the time. And Jung said, no, I have to do this. I'm doing this my own way. That in addition to his other ideas about the psyche.
I seem to recall an incident where the two of them were together.
Yes.
Let's talk about that.
Well, Freud had all sorts of dogmatic stances on all sorts of things, which is another part of why Jung left. But there was a disputed paranormal episode that happened in Freud's famed Berkeley 19 office, which I've been to. And I've been to Freud's office in London too, because I'm a total geek. And anyway, something happened, and Freud just thought it was all nonsense.
Do you recall the specifics?
I think it was a book that fell off the shelves kind of spontaneously, but I could be wrong.
Here's my recollection of that.
Well, you may know much more about that particular incident.
It's of interest because it has paranormal import. As I recall, there was some sort of large wooden furniture.
Yes.
And it made a loud crack.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Freud said, well, what was that? And Jung said, I can feel, he had a feeling, as I recall, in the solar plexus region. He said, it's about to happen again. And then there was a second crack.
Yes.
And I think it freaked Freud out.
Oh, yeah. I think Freud, to me, he strikes me as very controlling. And I think he was particularly not interested in things that he could not control.
You cite a letter from Freud to Jung in your book that is sort of indicative of that.
Yes. In the letter that I cite in the book, Teachings from the Gatekeeper, you see Freud he falls apart. You know, Jung decides that it's time for him to end his relationship. Well, he doesn't actually decide at this point, but Freud could see that it was going in that direction, that Jung was progressively severing the relationship. It wouldn't formally sever for another couple of years. And Freud he kind of falls apart. And you can see him fall apart in the letter. He's heartbroken over the fact that Jung is not just following along with how Freud saw these things.
And as I recall, Freud made some very grandiose statements like, I have anointed you my crown prince.
Oh, yeah. And I talk about, how he's got his ego, how he could be kingly enough to anoint anyone to be the prince of anything. Yeah. Freud was a genius without question. He was an extraordinary person.
And I think he realized that the psychoanalysis was a movement that was centering around him, and that he wanted Jung to become the crown prince of psychoanalysis.
Yes. Yes.
And again, if I recall correctly, in that letter, he suggested that Jung was ruining things with his interest in the paranormal.
Yes.
And yet we know that Freud also had an interest, but he felt that for political reasons, basically, because he wished to be regarded as a scientist, not a mystic, even though here his work was founded upon the idea of dream interpretation. And some scholars think dream interpretation from the Hasidic Jewish tradition to boot. He wanted to be seen as a scientist, and so he felt we had to shed all interest in the paranormal.
Yes, and I'm going to add to that, which is, of course, the paranormal involves mystery. Yeah. And if you're somebody who has to know the answer to absolutely everything, you don't like mystery. I think that was another part of what was repelling to Freud about parapsychology. Is he didn't fully understand it. And so because he didn't really understand it, he discredited it, and he looked down upon it, and he wanted to remove himself from it, as opposed to somebody like Jung, who goes, well, this is mysterious. What's going on? There's all sorts of cool and interesting stuff happening. I want to learn more about that. I want to go further into stuff that is mysterious.
In fact, Jung gave an address, I think in about 1916, I'm not sure of the exact date, to the Society for Psychical Research in London, in which he said, I will not make the foolish mistake that others seem so popular these days, to dismiss things that I don't understand.
Yes. Yes. It's very easy for people to dismiss whatever it is that they don't understand. People who describe themselves as scientists but don't really show true curiosity, and they don't really show true skepticism. In my opinion, they're not scientists. They're being something else, right? A scientist doesn't just discredit something simply because they don't understand it. That's not what they do.
But of course, we are human.
Yes.
First and foremost, as we described in our previous interviews, we're animals.
Yes.
Ultimately.
We most certainly are.
Or at least at our foundation. But I'm under the impression the breakup between Jung and Freud was maybe even harder on Jung than it was on Freud.
I think it must have been very rejecting for Freud and very, very upsetting. But I think Jung also had a lot of issues related to his father. He never had intellectual conversations with his father. I mean, he spoke about it at length in his book, on his memoir, basically.
His father, if I recall, was something of a conventional Protestant minister.
Yes, who was not interested in having intellectual conversations. And so when you look at what Jung did as an adult, he would have these extraordinary relationships with people like Jung, Pauli, Einstein, Rhine, these men who he could have these intellectual conversations with. And I think he was very much addressing that old wound that he had as a child.
I am under the impression that Jung even despised his father.
I think he had a very, very difficult relationship with him. And I think it was a hard time.
I seem to recall a dream.
Yes.
Jung reported
Yes.
in the dream I'm recalling, there were probably many. In fact, I'm sure there were many dreams of his father, but in this one that I'm thinking of, God appears and shits on the church.
Yeah.
Which seemed to reflect Jung's attitude towards his father's religion.
Yes. And his feelings about that particular church.
Mm-hmm. But then, after this breakup with Freud, if I recall correctly, Jung went into something almost a psychotic phase, the phase in which he worked on the Red Book,
Yes.
and which was kept secret for decades.
Yes.
Before it was revealed. Jung's family tried to keep it from becoming public because it seemed to show almost a psychotic side of Jung in terms of his visionary experiences. And much of that seemed to be his way of working through the separation with Freud, who had been his father figure.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it was such a big wound, the relationship that he had and did not have with his father. And then here he meets a father figure, and the relationship has to end. And it also ends in a way that's not really terribly resolved. So now he's got these two men who are these massive figures where there is this lack of resolution. Plus he's percolating on all of his ideas. And there's somewhat of a, it might look like a disintegration, right? But what was happening is that, I think, is that he was expanding his ideas so much, and he was going into so many different directions. It, may have been overwhelming for him, but it was certainly what was going to propel him to the next place.
Well, yes, many of his great theoretical achievements came out of that Red Book phase. And here's a little factoid you may not be aware of. In the Red Book, because it's filled with beautiful artwork.
Yes.
Jung was an amazing artist.
Absolutely, yes.
And he describes his interaction with various archetypal figures that he encountered through a process he describes as active imagination. Mm-hmm. And primary amongst these figures was one he called Philemon.
Yes.
Philemon was his guide and teacher, and many of his theories apparently came out of the inner dialogues he had with Philemon. Mm-hmm. And in the Red Book, there's a drawing, a beautiful drawing that Jung made of Philemon. Mm-hmm. And people have remarked, gee, that face, that looks like Freud.
Interesting. Well, Philemon being this guide and being this very emotionally safe figure who could guide him has a very, it has a wish aspect to it of a paternal figure who could be different than the two major paternal figures that he had up to that point.
Maybe the Freud that he wished he had had.
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So let's shift gears a little bit. Sure. and talk about Jung's relationship with J.B. Rhine, who is considered the father of American parapsychology.
Yes.
The person who made the word ESP popular.
Absolutely. Well, I think what happened with Jung and Rhine, they communicated mainly by letters, which is, of course, Jung's major communication with Freud was also by letters. And I think with Rhine, he found his first parapsychological colleague. One thing that I find particularly beautiful, and I write about this in the book, is that Jung grew up in a home that was right next to the Rhine River. And something to me just seems really beautiful about that this was the first person out of his family who he could really talk about parapsychological matters with and really explore them. The other people in his life, he was not able to do that with. He certainly couldn't do it with Jung, but there were other colleagues that he had that he couldn't do this with.
You mean he couldn't do it with Freud?
I'm sorry, that Jung couldn't do it with Freud. Sorry.
Well, he did write a doctoral dissertation about a medium who was his cousin.
Yes. Jung thankfully grew up in a family that was extremely open to parapsychological experiences. Both of his parents were open. His grandfather had visitations from his deceased wife. I mean, Jung had a circle of people around him who were very interested and open and receptive to the paranormal. And his cousin was a psychic medium who invited Jung to her seances. And she had a big impact on Jung's the theories that would develop later on about the psyche.
So undoubtedly he was attracted to Freud, who, now I'm mispronouncing, to Rhine.
Yes.
He was attracted to Rhine because Rhine was first and foremost a scientist.
Yes.
A scientist who was taking the paranormal and showing that it could be researched in the laboratory pretty much for the first time. There were some earlier examples, yes. But Rhine was at Duke University. He had his own parapsychology laboratory doing statistical tests over and over again.
Yes. He did thousands of parapsychological experiments. I mean, it has been estimated that he did 90,000 parapsychological experiments while he was on staff there for 30, 35 years, something in that zone. I'm not remembering the precise number.
While Rhine was doing the card guessing experiments primarily, yes. And dice throwing experiments, yes. Getting statistical results, his wife, Louisa, was collecting case histories.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yes. And she looked a lot into precognitive dreams, which I talk about in the books as well.
Yes. So all of this fascinated Jung.
Yes, absolutely. It was fascinating to him.
Was he in any way critical of Rhine?
I don't know the answer to that. I would imagine as somebody who's an MD and who's a scientist and a theorist that he examined this with certainly with a sense of professionalism, right? Where he would examine what was going on and do some constructive criticism. He must have. I can't imagine he looked at all of it and didn't have any constructive criticism there.
You report in your book about an incident in which there was a knife that had been shattered.
Yes. Jung apparently had these two very profound paranormal experiences. I mean, he had many paranormal experiences, but two of them that he talks about in a particular letter is a knife that explodes in 4 places. And there's also a 90-year-old wooden desk that's spontaneously split open. And he talked about these things with Rhine. Rhine asked him to send the knife, which he did not. But he did send him a photograph of the knife, which is still a part of Duke University's library system today.
And I am under the impression that Jung's relationship with Rhine led him to inspired him really, to develop his famous theory of synchronicity.
Actually, the first person was Albert Einstein. Einstein was a dinner guest of Jung's. And he's the one that first got him thinking about these ideas. And then there was Rhine. And he percolated on these ideas some more. And Jung thought about synchronicity for a long time before he really wrote anything and did anything on it. And he also met Wolfgang Pauli, who was a Nobel scientist, who was a physicist, who would also be the next person to influence Jung's
let's
ideas.
talk about Pauli.
Yes.
I'm not a physicist, but
Neither am I.
that physicists all agree Pauli was one of the very greatest physicists of the early 20th century.
Yes. He's a leader in quantum physics. But what happened, so it's a debated topic as to how exactly Jung and Pauli got to working on synchronicity. The part that's not debatable is that Pauli was in an absolutely terrible state at this time when he reached out to Jung. Jung was already a famous psychiatrist, but Pauli was in a terrible situation. He was drinking too much. His mother had just died by suicide. His father had married a woman who was Pauli's age, and he was in the process of a divorce. I mean, his life was falling apart. So he reached out to Jung, and initially Jung recommended Erna Rosenbaum. And here's where the debate is. Some people say that he worked with Erna Rosenbaum, who recorded Pauli's dreams, which then Freud analyzed separately.
Jung analyzed.
I'm sorry, Jung.
I know it's hard to keep them all straight.
Too many geniuses at once. Yeah. So there's so some people say that Erna Rosenbaum worked with Pauli first, and that she's the one who recorded the dreams that Jung would analyze. Other people say that Erna Rosenbaum worked with him at first, and then Pauli switched over to being Jung's client. And it's unclear. When you dig into that research some more, it is unclear. But Jung saw that Pauli tended to have a ton of archetypal dreams. And Jung was overwhelmingly much more interested in big dreams. He separated dreams according to two major categories. Little dreams that are the reflection of one's personal unconscious that happen during our daily lives. It's like the residue of our daily lives. And then there are the big dreams. And the big dreams are the dreams that relate to the archetypes. And Pauli had a lot of these. And in their work together, Pauli also said in a letter, after they stopped working together, he thought that there was a connection between psychology and physics. And what he didn't realize is that Jung had already been percolating on the idea of synchronicity. And in their letter exchange between Jung and Pauli, they went back and forth about their ideas on synchronicity. And so while it was Einstein and Rhine that really helped to inspire Jung's ideas on synchronicity, it was really Pauli who helped to refine Jung's ideas on synchronicity.
Well, I think many of these figures were very ambivalent about anything having to do with the paranormal. Einstein famously rejected quantum physics because it said the implications are that it leads to spooky action at a distance. Which we now know is true. It does lead to spooky action at a distance. Einstein was right in seeing that, but wrong in rejecting it for that reason. Right. And Einstein also, if I remember rightly, wrote an introduction to a book that came out in the 1930s by Upton Sinclair, the novelist, called Mental Radio, a book about clairvoyance that Einstein had a favorable opinion of. So all of these figures, like, they were very, very intrigued by the paranormal, at the same time, I think afraid of ruining their reputation by endorsing it in any way.
Yes.
I think even Jung was a bit ambivalent.
I think it was hard. And, one of the things that came across to me during the time of writing my book was how difficult it was for all of these people to be putting out their thoughts and their feelings and their research on these topics. It was an incredibly brave thing that each of them did.
As I recall, Jung wrote to Rhine and said to him, your work is part of the inspiration for the theory of synchronicity. So yes. Rhine was flattered and interested, but at the end of the day, to my understanding, he rejected Jung's notion of an acausal connection.
Yes, and how we were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, Rhine believed that the extrasensory perception, as he defined it, we would eventually come up with a causal understanding of it, that there must be a signal that goes from one place to another. There must be an organ of reception and an organ of transmission. But, now 50 years later, we can say we still haven't found them, that the Jung parapsychologists these days are much more open to Jungian ideas than they were initially.
Yes. Well, all of these men had a hard time, all of them in different ways, in terms of what they had to do to put themselves out there.
I'm particularly fascinated by Pauli's quest to integrate psychology and physics.
Yes. Well, he started making connections between Jung's ideas as in different ways. For example, the self. Pauli saw Jung's concept of the self as being similar to the atom. Mm-hmm. He saw the fourfold structure of the heart, which Jung, of course, called the quaternity. He saw that as being a symbol of evolution going closer towards wholeness. Mm-hmm. So Pauli was very, very interested in Jungian ideas and interested in deepening Jungian ideas into different ways.
My understanding is that Pauli did have a series of dreams in which there were guides, guide-like figures coming to him, if I recall, a mysterious woman, and explaining to him, I think in some precise mathematical terms, the relationship between mind and matter as being akin to the relationship between imaginary numbers and real numbers, and on the number scale, like they intersect. Which I've always thought was a very elegant explanation.
It is a very interesting explanation. It has a romantic quality to it, right? A man thinking of a woman in terms of math and how the woman would inspire him to think about math in a certain way. It has a romantic quality to it from a guy who was interested in math.
Well, and also, since you bring up romance, I have heard, and I don't know where I heard it or if it's true, but I seem to recall that Pauli fell in love with Marie-Louise von Franz, who was Jung's assistant, I think, at the time. Uh-huh. Do you know about that? I don't. Okay. Well, we'll have to leave it as a big question mark. But vaguely, I have the recollection that she also saw him as a patient, and that's how he fell in love, was telling her his dreams. Yeah. And I gather at the time she was an attractive young woman. But I know nothing further. Do you know anything about how that relationship evolved after in effect, Jung's great essay on synchronicity was published in a volume which included a separate essay by Pauli. Mm-hmm. Yes, they published quite a bit together on synchronicity. And if I remember rightly, Pauli's essay had something to do with Kepler, the great astronomer who was also an astrologer. Mm-hmm. Yes, and Jung, of course, was fascinated by that. something I'm sure Freud would have rejected out of hand.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But Freud had a very particular vision and a very particular set of theories that he was totally committed to consistently focusing on. And he wanted people within his inner circle who would focus on those things exclusively. He couldn't do everything, so.
And then there's another fascinating chapter. I believe a movie was actually made about it. What was it called? Dangerous Relationships or something?
Yes.
About Jung's affair with, was it Sabrina Spielrein? I hope I have her first name correct, Spielrein. Apparently Jung did have an extramarital affair with her, and she later became a Freudian.
The ultimate betrayal. But I think, they didn't understand the psychotherapeutic process in the same way that we understand it now, in terms of boundaries, the importance of maintaining boundaries. They were in the process of discovering these things. Yeah. And so they didn't really fully grasp that in the way that we, of course, do today. And we see these as horrible boundary violations.
Yeah, I mean, today it's an absolute taboo for a therapist to engage in fact, any kind of relationship with a patient outside of the therapy office.
Yes, it is a dual relationship.
Any dual relationship, let alone a sexual intimacy.
Yes, absolutely.
Of course, I think it's fair to say that rule gets violated often.
In terms of the non-sexual or in terms of this?
Both.
Well, the number one cause of formal board complaints is because there's some sort of sexual violation that happens. I mean, but again, though, these men at that time, they didn't really fully understand all of the pieces that were happening in terms of transference and countertransference and all the distortions that happen, right? I mean, it's my clients, if I was to give them a test, how well do you know me? I mean, they'd fail. They don't really know me. They see a version of me, right? As Dr. Brimberg, I'm there to help them. Everything that we talk about is for them. It's a time that is exclusively devoted to them. If for some reason I have to speak about myself about something, I give myself 2 minutes and then I give myself the hook. That's it. This is for them. Yeah. It's not for me. And so what happened back then is there was a whole experience going on that they weren't seeing the way that we see these things today.
They also came out of a European culture in which the authority of the male, the strong male figure, was unquestioned.
Yes.
And so it would be natural for people of great importance like Freud and Jung and Breuer, who was Freud's teacher, and others, to take advantage at times of their clients. And this has now been criticized in the literature quite a bit.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yes.
But it was a different era.
It was. It was. I mean, although Freud was talking about countertransference and transference and all of that, I mean, he was starting to understand all of that. But the other piece, too, is you're talking about emotional intimacy that happens. Now, it's distorted, right? Because the therapist is not emotionally intimate in the same way, right? Because it's not about them, it's about the client. So you have this emotional intimacy or a variation of emotional intimacy with a highly vulnerable person who's there constantly disclosing whatever it is that are their, whether it's their deepest, darkest secrets or their concerns or whatever it is, right? They are in an inherently vulnerable position.
And I'm under the impression, too, that very often, even going back to the era of Mesmer, another 100 years before,
Yes.
that the clients or patients were largely female.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
And in fact, some diseases like hysteria was quite common with.
I was just thinking of that. Yeah. Right. I mean, and it's so, I hate to say it, but it's kind of typical that the person in the authority figure role, a man, would just conceptualize it as hysteria, the wandering uterus, right? I mean, it's a very disempowering perspective for those women. And yet that was the time that they lived in.
That was the time in which they lived, in which women were fundamentally regarded as inferior. I mean, they didn't have the vote in the United States until 1922 or so.
That's right. I couldn't wear pants. I couldn't reveal my, this part of me. I couldn't reveal my hands. Mm-hmm. Couldn't reveal my arms, my feet. All of these things would be scandalous.
So the whole discipline of depth psychology emerged out of that milieu.
Yes. Yes.
Obviously, it impacted the relationships that these people had.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think in the case of Jung, it is now at least well known that he was a man who had, although he had a deep and profound relationship with his wife Emma, he had affairs, as many European men in that era did.
Yes, it's true.
Do you know any more about how Jung's relationship with Pauli evolved over time?
They worked together for many years. And when Jung opened up the C.G. Jung Institute, Pauli was right there with him. Mm-hmm. They had a professional relationship. I believe it lasted 26 years.
So in effect, Pauli himself was both a patient and a colleague.
Well, the degree to which he's a patient, that's the debatable part. Yeah. It's unclear. There's a lot of defensiveness. When you dig into that literature, I can tell you, there's a ton of defensiveness out there as to how much exactly he was Jung's client, but it is unclear.
To become, for example, a psychoanalyst, one was required to go through analysis.
Yes. Yes.
So I recall one story where Jung and Freud were both invited to the United States to speak, if I remember rightly, at Clark University. Exactly. And so they had to come across the Atlantic Ocean on a boat together. And Jung, whose wife was extremely wealthy, had a first-class ticket, and though Freud was well-to-do, I think he had a second-class ticket on the ship. But they would get together and share their dreams while they were going across the ocean. Yes. And if I recall correctly, some friction developed between them on that trip over the dreams. I don't recall the details, but I seem to, I believe at some point Freud decided he didn't wish to share his dream. Mm-hmm. So there was, I mean, amongst the analysts at the time, there was an effort at some kind of emotional intimacy and professionalism in terms of looking at each other's dreams. And at the same time, there were emotional complexities in their relationship that were not really resolved. Yes. And so you're trying to be a professional in the area of emotional intimacy while you're dealing with emotional problems of your own. It's a conflict, I suppose, that often psychotherapists have to deal with.
Yes. However, I think one of the most important things that we can do is to understand ourselves, right? Whether we're psychologists or not. But certainly as a psychologist, you have to be able to look at whatever your stuff is. All of us have it. And the more that we understand ourselves, the better we are going to be able to help other people. It's astounding to me how many professionals don't actually do this work. And in the process, they can wind up acting out all sorts of issues that they have not resolved. And they can wind up acting them out with their clients. It's really...
With regard to Jung,
yes,
you did describe him as a great inspiration and a great genius. Obviously, he had father issues.
Yes. Yes.
But he seemed over time to resolve those issues. I think, maybe the Red Book, people are still trying to probe the depth of all of the episodes of active imagination in the Red Book itself. But I'm inclined to think that if there has ever been a theorist who has a handle on the nature of the paranormal, Jung has probably come closer than anybody I know.
Yes. He did so many extraordinary things in his lifetime. Absolutely.
People, I've interviewed several writers who talk about Jung not as a psychotherapist, but as a mystic himself. And there was that side to him. He tried to be professional. He tried to be scientific. He tried to avoid metaphysics, metaphysical pronouncements in his writing, but they do come through.
Yes. I'm thinking of a quote of his: "The privilege of a lifetime is to be who you truly are." That is a quotation of his.
That's beautiful. Well, Davis Brimberg, once again, a great joy to be with you. And it's not just a joy, it's an intellectual adventure.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's been such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I am very happy that you came. And for those of you listening or watching, thank you too for being with us, because ultimately, you are the reason that we are here. Book 2 in the New Thinking Aloud Dialogues book series is a tribute to parapsychologist Russell Targ, celebrating his 90th birthday. New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.